You may be seated. If you would bow your heads one more time with me as I pray for me, and pray for yourselves as well, that God would talk to us. Heavenly Father, we're grateful that you love us. We're grateful that you are here. We're grateful that you've sent Jesus. There are so many different things that we can be thankful for today. So many ways that you've blessed us. And yet, as we come into this morning, for many, this is not a happy day. Certainly, for some families around the country today, as they're grieving the loss of their loved ones. And then if we start to think about around the world, there's so much grief there with all of the tragedies that are occurring. We say, Lord, that we believe in you, and we say that we love you, and that we trust that you're good all the time. I pray that you would be good and meet us here this morning. As we look at your word, I pray that you would meet your people, and that your voice would be heard through me. That you would be heard. Help me to communicate accurately, to re-talk your talk this morning. To re-say in a way that makes sense and applies what you've already said in your word to us here. We thank you for your word. We thank you for what you're going to do. In Jesus' name, amen. Multiple shootings in the last 24 hours. At least 30 dead. There was 4 drownings in Oregon this week. One of them was a 7-year-old. Death, health concerns, financial issues, divorce, relationship. Life is pain. And not intending to lighten it, but to quote one of my favorite movies, life is pain, and if anyone tells you otherwise, they're selling something. If you don't know the reference, you can ask me later. The fallenness of this world is obvious. It is probably the most provable and proven doctrine of the Christian faith. It is incredibly obvious that humanity is broken, that our world is broken. But it still isn't shocking when we see it. We're still, even we who profess that humanity is broken, that the world is not right, we still are amazed at just how messed up things are, how hard life can be. It's like the lie of the human heart that it's good is so seductive. The number of dead in just the last 100 years is in the billions from their own government. It's just amazing. And we're shocked by it. Blindsided. But the Bible is not shocked by that. And the Bible doesn't ignore it. It speaks about the pain of reality, the pain of death, a lot. That's why it's amazing that we still don't see it. And perhaps the most famous book that talks about the problem of pain, the problem of suffering in the world is Job. But it's the book of Ruth that also talks about that. And Ruth has an interesting viewpoint that I think might be very helpful. We think of the arguments in Job seem so philosophical at times, and so, because it's primarily poetry, it's hard to read at times. And it's set in such a global, cosmic setting that the person seems to sometimes get lost. But not in Ruth. Not in Ruth. The central character of this book that we're going to be looking at over the next about 8 weeks is actually Naomi. It's not Ruth. We think Ruth might be the main character, but it's actually not. Ruth is a critical person in the response of God to Naomi, but the person that this book is about is actually Naomi, Ruth's mother-in-law. She's the one that who's wrestling with the issues that are laid out for us in these first 5 verses, where her life is devastated. And she blames God. And she's angry about it, and she's bitter about it. What we're going to look at for these next 8 weeks is this book, as we look at the question, this book that talks about pain, and see what is God's response to pain, to tragedy, by examining this story. So often we Christians kind of gloss over the sorrows of life. I mean, we rush to just pretend that life's okay. There's so few laments in modern Christian music, but there are lots of them in the Bible. That's why I had Alex do that song to start off with. We're going to sing after the sermon again, because it's truly a lament. Today, we're going to look at just 5 verses as we go through here, where we see Naomi's life devastated. Let's read through it. Book of Ruth, chapter 1, verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab. He and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of the wife of his wife was Naomi. And the names of his sons were Maon and Chilion. They're Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judea. They went into the country of Moab, and they remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth. They lived there about 10 years. And both Maon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Full stop. We need to stop right here and appreciate this moment, this issue that the rest of this book is going to deal with. Naomi's life is devastated, beyond what most of us can imagine. On par, and in some ways, as I'll explain, greater than Job. It comes in a way of 3 things. Three circumstances, and then kind of 3 personal tragedies. The first one is in the days that the judges ruled. The days of the judges. There's a book about Judges. It's the one, depending on which Bible you have, it's the book right before this, Days of the Judges. It's a horrible time. It's a book of these cycles of sin and oppression and lawlessness. If you'd like, you can turn over to chapter 2, and you'll get the pattern here. Chapter 2, verse 11. chapter 2, verse 11, it gives you the sense of the storyline that's repeated over and over and over in this book. Chapter 2, verse 11. And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. They abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of Egypt, and went after other gods from among the other gods of the people who were around them, and bowed down to them. They sinned. They do the wrong thing. They provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord. They served the Baals and Ashtoreth. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to plunderers who plundered them, and he sold them into the hands of the surrounding enemies, so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. So they sin, they provoke God to anger, and God brings a judgment. Usually, it's another nation that comes in and oppresses them. They're not treated rightly. They're not treated well. This is not good for the people of Israel. And their response after a period of time is they cry out. Verse 16, but then the Lord raised up judges who saved them from the hand of those who plundered them. So they'll cry out. God will raise up someone like a Gideon, for example, or a Samson. And he rescues them from the people who've done bad things to God's people. And they go, yay, God, this is wonderful. We'll go back and following you. But what do? Yet they did not listen to their judges, for they whored after other gods and bowed down to them. And they soon turned aside from the way in which their fathers walked. They do it all over again. This is the cycle. This is the cycle. Turn over to chapter 3. You see the same thing here. This pattern just keeps being repeated. Verse 7. And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God. They served the Baals and the Ashtoreth. Therefore the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and they sold them into the land of this king from Mesopotamia. And the people of Israel served him for 8 years. When the people of Israel cried out to the Lord, he raised up a deliverer. So down to verse 11, so they had rest. And then you see in the very next verse, and the people of Israel did again what was evil in the sight of the Lord. You see, it just keeps going over. It's this mantra over and over. This is the days that is being talked about here in Ruth. Over and over. You think it's hard to be a Christian now? It actually was not easy then. Because constantly there would be your neighbors would be going after bad gods who would do things like sacrifice their children to Molech, to the Baals, would do really horrible things. That it wasn't popular to follow Yahweh. And God would come and bring an oppressive kingdom against them and abuse them and put them to slave labor. Not good. Violence, cruelty, oppression, uncertainty. This is the day of the judges. This is the days that Ruth is living in. The hard time of war and injustice. So this is the first circumstance that she's living in. Not a good time. Back to Ruth, verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. Now, this is one that we, frankly, as Americans, really don't understand. You just don't. Not unless somebody here has actually visited a place that's actually in the middle of a famine, can we really get it. This is not, oh no, they ran out of bread at Safeway. This is not that. This is not that, oh no, they don't have my particular favorite kind of stuff in the store. This isn't even, there's not a lot in the grocery store. There is nothing in the grocery store. And it's not just for a day or a week, but months of nothing. And I'm not making this up, tree bark looks good. No, really. That's actually not a joke. I just read a story this morning about a famine that had gone on in the recent decades in Africa, where they were talking seriously about which tree bark tastes better. How would you like to have that for your food today? Tree bark. It's difficult for us to grasp how hard a famine is. Truly, as hard as the Great Depression was on Americans, and it was very bad, it's not as bad as a true famine. And that's what she's going through, a true famine, where there's not just not a lot of food, there's no food, and there's none in sight. Where your anger at why somebody who has the little bit that they have holds on to it eventually gives into despair because they don't have any more food. Where that despair ends up turning into fear, and then an awful silence on the street because you can't work. There's no reason to work. You don't want to move because you don't want to expend energy. It's this awful silence. This is what a famine is. People who track and look at these kinds of things say, really, famines are one of the very worst things that can happen to humanity. This is what she's going through. Not only is she living in the days of Judges, where there's this oppression, that it's difficult to be a faithful follower of Yahweh, and there's this constant uncertainty, but then there's also, in the middle of all that, she has a famine hit. And she does, her and her husband, about the only thing you possibly could think of doing. She goes to Moab. The third circumstance. What's the big deal about that? Well, Moab is like a really bad place to go if you're a Yahweh follower in the Old Testament. If you're a believer in God, if you are an Israelite, those are the bad people, and for good reason. In Numbers 25, these are the people who led God's people into sin. These are the people who tried to curse them. In the king of Moab, Balak, in Numbers 22, 24, they're the ones that brought the prophet to come and curse the nation. This is why in Deuteronomy they are barred for being married into any Jewish family for 10 generations. These are not your friends. These are not your good buddies. They're actually cousins. They're the relatives. They're the children of Lot, Abraham's brother. But they're not your friends. Remember I was talking a moment ago about these judges? In chapter 3, the one very much after the one I talked about, is this guy named Ehud. He's from Moab. He could even be one of the people that is oppressing God's people in this moment. And she's going there. It's not a good place. In addition to the fact that it's moving. Have you ever moved across the country? It's not easy. You have no friends. You're not sure where everything is. It's hard. It's a new culture. Ever moved into a new culture? May not speak the language. This is difficult stuff. Stressful. In addition to all of that, there's no temple in Moab. So, she can't worship rightly in Moab. There's no priests. There's no way to sacrifice rightly according to the Mosaic law in Moab. This is not good. 3 circumstances of her life put her in a place where things are just not good. She's gone as it were, out of the frying pan into the fire. They may have had food there, but in every other way, it is not good to be in Moab. These are the circumstances of her life. But that's not where it ends. She has 3 personal losses that would bring anybody to their knees. The first one is she loses her husband. Verse 2, the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Maon and Chilion. Okay, husband, two sons, and a husband, and then they end up marrying 2 children, right? But the husband dies. They went to the country of Moab, and they remained there. Verse 3, but Elimelech, her husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. You go, losing a husband is devastating. I mean, do I really need to even explain that? It's the number 1 life stressor, they say, is to lose a spouse. And I know some of us have lost their husbands, their wives. It's something you don't get over, ever. You learn to cope, but you don't get over it. But at this point in this story, she still has her children. They're grown children. And you have to imagine the day this is. Okay, so her husband's not there to take care of her and make sure, provide for the family. But her children are. It's the social security of the day. At least the children can work the land, produce the food, produce what the family needs to survive. These 2 took Moabite wives. Oh, good. Things are getting, it's a horrible tragedy. Life's bad, but they're married. Children are going to be on the way, right? Good. Okay. But then they die. Verse 5. No parent should ever bury a child. She didn't lose one. She lost both. Both. And depending on how you read this, she may have endured 10 long years of being childless. It's awful to long for children and not have them. That pain of infertility. But then the worst comes of all. She loses those kids. Not just her husband, not just her children, but no grandchildren, and her children, her babies die. And with them, all normal hope is gone. She's an elderly woman, alone in the world, with no one to take care of her. And this is why in some ways I'm saying it's harder on her than even Job. Job lost all of his kids, so did she. Job lost all of his possessions. She has nothing. But she's a woman in a man's world. She's a woman in a world where she has very little status, and she simply cannot provide for herself. Unlike in modern America, if you're a single woman, you have the capability to actually live by yourself, but not then. Job didn't have his health, but she couldn't even take care of herself. It's at least comparable to Job in this moment. And the crazy thing is with Job, you're going, but we know he's righteous. We hear that at the beginning of the story. We have no idea about Naomi. We have no idea, is she a good person or a bad person? We don't have the benefit of it. All we know is life hurts for her at this moment, and it is absolutely bleak and despairing for her. She's a normal person. You know how many people lose their husbands young? A lot. How many children die before their parents? A lot. How many people go through economic hardships? A lot. Although her life is hard, it's really not that unusual. Three shadows of circumstance, three shadows of personal loss. If this was a movie, these would be the opening minutes. If this was a movie, it'd be the opening minutes of a drama where you see a lone woman on the ground weeping, totally destroyed. This is Naomi, filled with nothing but grief and only with bitterness. And we are the readers. We're left with sympathy and questions. Why has God done this? What is going on here? This is the issue that the rest of this book deals with. How is Naomi going to be taken care of? Where is God in the midst of this? It's the question many of us have asked in our own tragedies when we had something happen to us, whether it's just simply losing a job or the loss of someone we love. Where's God? What are you doing? Why is this happening? How will God respond to this? What does Naomi say why this happened? She answers it explicitly. Look down to verse 20. She answers clear as a bell why she thinks this is occurring to her. Verse 20. She said to them, her two daughters, "Do not call me Naomi," which means sweet. "Call me Mara," which means bitter. "The Almighty has dealt very bitterly to me. I went away full, children, husband. Life was somewhat okay, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me? The Almighty has brought calamity upon me." She blames God. And she's bitter. Bitter is not just anger. Anger, when it cools and it settles in, becomes bitterness. That's where she's at. Who's to blame? Well, let's think this through, because I want you to hear this a little bit. What are the circumstances? Some of those circumstances you can't really lay at God's feet. Some of those are just people. The fact that she lives in the days of the judges, is that really in a sense her fault, God's fault? These are sinful people's actions. Why is there this horrible cycle in Judges? It's because God's people keep doing the wrong thing. They're sinning. It's people's own actions why that circumstance is there. Her move to Moab, and the fact that Moab is a bad place and her move there, she made that choice, not God. So some of these things, is human will is involved. But some of these are not human will involved. The fact there's a famine, God determined that. And the death of her two children and her husband, God determines when someone dies. The Bible is absolutely crystal clear on that. There's no ambiguity in this. Jesus in Matthew 10, saying that a sparrow does not fall to the ground apart from my Father's will. And the context is that you need not to worry about whether or not you're going to live or die, what's going to happen to you when you testify to me. Why? Because even a sparrow doesn't, his death is something that God determines. So the application is if someone's going to die, it has to be God's decision to do it. That's the whole point of the context there. Job 14, verse 5. This is Job speaking. We could argue that some of his friends are not necessarily speaking truth, but this is Job, and nowhere does God correct Job's theology. He says, since his days, a person's days are determined, the number of his months are with you. You have appointed the limits. He cannot pass. People die when God says they die. Is there human action and will somehow entangled? Yes. God, the free will, God, and predestination thing is a tangle. But it is hard to get around the fact, and these are just two of many verses that he says that when someone dies, ultimately it is God's choice. God's to blame, in large part to her circumstances. She's correct. Guys, that's a hard, bitter pill to swallow, but that's the case here, guys. There's many things we can attribute to human decision, human will. That's right, absolutely. Including the death of Jesus. Human's will was involved with that, but so was God's will. Ecclesiastes 7:14 talks about that good and bad come from God. The day of prosperity, be joyful. And the day of adversity, consider. God has made us one as well as the other. Isaiah 45:7. I form light. This is God speaking. I form light. I create darkness. I make well-being and I create calamity. I am the Lord who does all these things. She blames God. And she's bitter. She's angry. And she's despairing. Because, if you look carefully at what she says, because God is against her. That's not true. And therefore she's bitter. Right source, wrong assumption, therefore bitter. This is a normal person. This is a normal person, and it's a normal life story. But it's a divinely interpreted one. Because what we're going to see is God's response to this tragedy, that God is definitely not against her. We're going to see that as we deal with real people in a real life, in a real circumstance, and maybe something is going on in your life where you're going, what is God doing to me right here? And you will see that God is not against you. In these 5 verses, we need to stop, though. We need to stop right here and just appreciate the devastation of Naomi's life. We need to not rush past this. We need to not rush. We need to stop. And we need to do something that the Bible tells you to do, which is to lament. We need to not to make the mistakes of Job's friends. My dear people, when you see someone struggling in your life, please don't make the mistake of Job's friends. Job's friends sat with him a long time, 7 days. They were doing a great job. Then they opened their mouth. My dear people, you got to hear me with this. People in the midst of grief, they don't want your answers. They want you to be with them. And sometimes that just, it's because we get so uncomfortable with pain, especially in America where we've done everything in our power to not hurt. We bubble wrap our children. Why? Because we don't want them to hurt, and that's understandable. I don't want my kids to hurt, but life is pain. This is going to happen. But we don't want to do with pain. We don't like that. We need to learn to lament, my dear people. I want you to see here that if nothing else, this book is addressing pain, devastation. You need to embrace pain because life is pain until Jesus comes back and he wipes every tear. Then life will no longer be pain. Then there will be no more suffering. He's promised it. But in this day, it's good to grieve. We need to lament because it's biblical. Do you know how many psalms are lamenting psalms? For example, Psalm 10, Psalm 77, Psalm 142. There's a whole book called Lamentations. It's a huge lamenting of a prophet for the nation of Israel. We need to lament because it's real. Because life does hurt. Because life is painful. It is how to deal with pain in your life. Whether it's the pain of just simply, I've lost my job, or it's the loss of a loved one, or maybe because life really is just hard. You need to learn to lament. Because that's how God has designed you to be, to lament. You should be lamenting the pain in your life. You should be lamenting your sin. You should be lamenting things like just what's going on in another person's life. You need to lament. What is lament? It's talking to God about pain. It's prayer in the midst of pain, saying, I'm going to you with it. You know, we need to lament for ourselves, and we need to lament for the people around us. It's loving. It's weeping with those who weep. Romans 12:15. It's an act of faith because it believes that God can do something. So how do you lament? And this is kind of where we'll kind of wrap up. How do you lament? Psalm 13 gives you a pattern because all the laments generally have a basic pattern. Here's the first one. Part of it is you go to God. Oh Lord, how long will you forget me? How long will you look the other way? Stop. No, go back. The first one is just you need to get into the face of God with your pain. You need to be that child who crawls up in their parents' laps, grabs them by the face, and looks them right in the face. That's what you need to do with your pain. You need to get in there and say, God, are you looking at me? Do you understand what's going on? You need to live in the presence of God himself. And by the way, who is the face of God? It's Jesus. Get in his face. Go to him with your pain. Second, you need to be raw and honest about it. Verse 2. Listen how he says, how long must I struggle with the anguish of my soul? With sorrow in my heart every day? How long? Can you hear the emotion there? None of this, hey God, that really hurts right now. No. You need to, maybe you need to scream at God. Go take a walk, close the door in your house, whatever it is. Let it out. Tell God what you think. He already knows. But the point is you need to express it to him. God, this hurts. I don't understand. I don't like this. It tells him that you care. You got to be real with God, raw, honest, in his face, telling him what you think about this circumstance. And telling him what you want. Be bold. Verse 3 and 4. Turn, answer me, God. Restore the sparkle in my eyes. I'm going to die. Now, he may not answer your request, but you need to at least ask him, because maybe he will. What do you want? Tell him the questions you have. But here's what you have to do after having done all that. Getting into his face, telling him what you're really feeling, telling him what you really want. Then you got to choose to trust. And I say those words exactly. You have to say, I'm going to trust you no matter what happens here. Verse 5 and 6. But I will trust your unfailing love. I'll rejoice because you have rescued me. I will sing to the Lord because he's good to me. And you may not feel those words, but it's a choice that I am going to believe you whether I see it or not. As we sang, I will wrestle with your heart. When I can't see your hand, I'm still going to wrestle with it. There's the one side, there's the pain of just life hurts, but don't go to the place where you're bitter, where you've came to the place of assuming God's against you. This psalmist is not doesn't believe God's against him. He just doesn't understand. Lament with pain and trust that God's with you. Sit in your grief. Sit in there. Don't rush. Don't rush. Stay right there in it. It's okay to grieve. It's okay to not have an answer. It's okay to just scream at God and say that it hurts. The psalmist does it all the time. My application for you today is really simple. I want you to lament. I want you to lament. If you have something in your own life you need to grieve over, do it. Take some time, set some aside to really do it, to explore it and tell God what really is going on in your life. If you're not grieving, you need to. If you're not grieving today, you should be. Even if it's not over your own sin, although you probably should for that too, somebody else's. Because y'all know somebody in your life who's going through a tragedy. Weep with those who weep. Grieve with those who grieve. Whether it's your own... Maybe it's your own sin. Maybe it's the sin of the country. You're angry and you're upset because this or that is going on in the country. Have you lamented it? Have you confessed it? Have you wept over the sin of your own country? Have you wept over the sin of the tragedy happening in somebody you love? Lament today. The book of Ruth is about pain. It is about God's response to it. And the first thing we need to see here is that God is addressing it. He sees it. It's okay to lament. Let's do that. Let's pray. Father God, thank you that you see us in our pain.